Thank you, everybody. I hope this lives up to your expectations about Vikings. I tried. Okay, so my talk is entitled Viking Women in the West, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a background about the Viking Age, and then tell you some pieces from my dissertation. So, first, I'd like to acknowledge that there is debate over the proper definition and use of the word Viking. But I'll be using it to mean groups of migratory peoples from Scandinavia, both men and women, who traveled and settled outside of their homelands. I'll also be simplifying many concepts which are the subject of controversy in medieval scholarship, so if you happen to be a Norse scholar, I'm sorry. The popular story of the Vikings begins in 793, when they burst onto the historical scene with a spectacularly violent attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. From the beginning, the Vikings had a bit of an image problem. They were depicted, as you see in this quote, as devils sent to punish good Christian people for their sins. Their fast ships, fearlessness in battle, and disregard for Christian sanctity turned them into an almost mythical horror that appeared out of nowhere to ravage unprotected religious centers and then disappeared just as quickly. It also doesn't help that during the period which scholars refer to as the Viking Age, between about the 8th and 12th centuries AD, both England and Ireland underwent nationalist revivals, using the word nationalist sort of cautiously, under the auspices of King Alfred the Great in England in the 9th century and Brian Boehmer in 11th century Ireland, which saw the Vikings scapegoated as evil foreigners, unwanted immigrants, and threats to cultural and political unity. As you can see, Brian Boehmer is credited for kicking the Vikings out of Ireland. They came back, but it was good for a while. It also doesn't help that the Vikings themselves did not leave any written records of their activities. Though they did have a written language based on a runic alphabet with 16 characters, they only used it to carve very short inscriptions, such as the one you see here, left by a Norse visitor to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul sometime in the 9th century. Most of the contemporary literature about the Vikings comes from the inhabitants of the regions where they raided, traded, and settled. The first texts written by descendants of Viking migrants come from 12th century Iceland. Iceland had never been inhabited by humans when Scandinavians settled there in the 10th century. It is a remarkable example of a society built totally from scratch, and it is often considered one of the first true republics, where there was no central authority, and any disputes were settled at large assemblies, using a sophisticated corpus of laws, memorized and recited in full once a year by an elected law speaker. The Icelanders converted to Christianity all at once, following an island-wide vote in 999 AD. The arrival of monks and Christian clerics also meant the arrival of Latin and the manuscript tradition. The first manuscript in the Icelandic vernacular or native language is the Íslendingabók, a catalog of early settlers. The settlers spoke Old Norse, a Germanic language that is the ancestor of modern-day Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic. Iceland has remained so isolated throughout its history that modern Icelandic is almost unchanged from the language spoken about 400 years before these texts were written, and different. It's the same as today. And texts written in Old Norse are mostly intelligible to modern Icelanders. So something like this, if you could read the tiny words, you might be able to understand if you were a modern Icelander. Iceland is famous for producing its own literary genre, the Saga, the Old Norse word for story. Likely based on oral traditions passed down from previous generations, hundreds of sagas were recorded beginning in the 12th century. Many were set during the Viking Age, about 300 years earlier. The sagas are astonishing literary accomplishments full of complicated family dynamics, intricate legal disputes, tragic blood feuds, and sweeping romances. But most scholars agree that they can't be considered faithful representations of life in the Viking Age because of the considerable political, social, and religious transformations that had taken place in the intervening centuries. Nevertheless, for lack of other better sources, Viking Age scholars use the sagas cautiously to identify long-lasting social traditions that may have continued unchanged over the centuries, and to examine the intentions of Icelandic authors when writing about their history, how they viewed their ancestors, and how they wished to shape their past. So one of the most important ways of understanding how Icelanders shaped their history is through genealogical records. they were pretty obsessed with their origins. They were a nation of immigrants, much like the United States, and they traced their ancestries as far back as Adam and Eve, and to the Trojans, and to the Huns, all kinds of people. But they usually sought to connect themselves with powerful families from Norway. However, scholars have increasingly come to realize that many settlers of Iceland came via the British Isles and other regions other than Norway. As this slide will show you, the Viking migration was quite expansive. It extended from modern-day Kiev in Ukraine, and traders reached all the way to Baghdad and met some Arab empires. And then all the way to the other side of the world, they made it to North America and built a settlement in Newfoundland. They also settled in Wales, and they provided the namesake for the French province of Normandy, Norman meaning Northman. Migrants from Denmark established the Danelaw in northern England, which was a kingdom centered on the city of York. And Norwegians and Danes founded towns in Ireland, including Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick. Their influence in all these regions lasted for centuries. Place names throughout the British Isles reflect Norse habitation, and until the mid-1700s, inhabitants of the Orkneys and the Shetlands, which are some islands very far north of England, they still spoke a Norse-based language called Norn, which died out by the end of the 1700s, but people are trying to revive it for some reason. And many Irish and Scottish surnames, as you can see here, were associated with Viking descent. So settlement in the British Isles began much earlier than in Iceland. So when the Icelandic landnám, or land-taking, began in the early 10th century, many of the settlers came not from Norway, but from the British Isles. And this is kind of where my dissertation comes in. So there's been DNA analysis recently of modern populations in Iceland and also some of the islands off the coast of Scotland, which show that approximately 60% of the population of Iceland currently has maternal DNA, which only is passed through the female line, which is consistent with British or Irish ancestry. And so even accounting for things like genetic drift, which can cause kind of random changes in the genetics of a population, it's pretty much certain that at least half of the women who settled Iceland initially were either from Britain or Ireland. And also genetic analysis of Scotland and the Orkneys shows that the populations contained equal amounts of DNA from Scandinavian men and women, which basically tells us that it was a family-based migration rather than the sort of typical idea of hordes of young men descending on Britain. There were women, there were children, and so we can't think of it as a male-only migration. So these two facts kind of motivated my examination of the Icelandic sagas, which talk about Viking migration to the Western diaspora, circled here, which includes Iceland and the British Isles. As many modern theorists have begun to do with contemporary migrations, I'm looking at the feminization and diversification of the Viking migration to the West. So I'm basically trying to identify how differences in gender and ethnic composition between the various settlements might have given rise to unique social dynamics, and also how Icelandic authors chose to write, or sometimes not write, about gender and ethnic diversity in their history. So as I was saying, they were really obsessed with where they came from. They wrote tons of genealogies in the sagas, and they were more willing than sort of contemporary Europeans to include women in those genealogies, which people have taken to mean oh, they really respected women and they wanted to include them in their family histories. But actually it turns out that a lot of the female characters that are inserted in these genealogies are made up. And so I wanted to know why. And one of the things that I figured out was they tend to invent women to connect men to other great men, particularly legendary figures like famous Ragnar Lothbrok, who you might recognize from the TV series Vikings. That's him in the middle. That's his brother who starts the colony in Normandy, quote unquote. So this was especially true of Irish women. which points to an interesting paradox of Icelandic history. The large number of British or Irish women that entered the population during the settlement period was almost certainly made up of slaves. So slavery was a pretty common practice in the Middle Ages, and a lot of scholars have argued that the primary motivation for Viking raids was actually slave taking. There's definitely dispute about that, but there's no question that they were taking slaves, mostly from Britain and Ireland. And there are countless episodes in Irish texts and English texts that tell of Vikings descending on the population and gathering up all their women and sailing away. And it's also clear that later Icelanders were aware of this fact and pretty uncomfortable about it. So one version of the 13th century Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements, explains the text's purpose in recounting family histories as trying to prove that Icelanders weren't descended, as you can see, from slaves or evil men. And we also see very few British or Irish women in genealogies, which is likely because they were Irish slaves whose ancestry added little luster to the family. Where Irish women do appear, they are often said to be the daughters of kings. As you can see here, a woman who was taken as a slave in Ireland tells her captor that she is the daughter of a king. And these Celtic princesses are almost certainly fictional, which shows us that the need to raise up female ancestors to royal heights shows kind of an anxiety experienced by Icelanders who knew that many of their ancestresses had been Irish slaves, but wished to erase that fact. So, Melkorka, Mercuriatan's daughter, is a character from Laxdæla Saga, which is written in the 13th century, and she's one of the only examples of a woman who speaks openly about her experiences as a slave. She was captured in Ireland at the age of 15 and brought home to Iceland. She's really interesting because of the way that she uses, or sometimes doesn't use, language, which is another thing that I'm focusing on in my dissertation. When she's purchased, the slave trader who sells her says that she can't speak or won't speak, but she's purchased anyway, and she never speaks to her master until one day he stumbles upon her speaking to her son in Irish. And then he says, oh, you have to tell me like who you are and what's going on. So she tells him the story about the fact that she's a Celtic princess, apparently speaking to him in Norse, which I guess she picked up. And it's very interesting because it's one of the few stories that tells us about the sort of relationship between Celtic immigrants in Iceland and language. She also doesn't behave like a slave. Her captor's wife calls her deaf, which suggests that she also doesn't respond to commands and is sort of like resisting her treatment as a slave, which is kind of like from a modern standpoint, it looks like she's using very modern tactics of like feminist resistance and silence, and so I'm sure that's probably not what the Icelandic saga author meant, but it's interesting nonetheless. So from other literary evidence, we know that there were a variety of other languages spoken in the area. They encountered speakers of Welsh and Latin, and sometimes they also encountered Native Americans. So there's an episode over there where a woman, Gudrur, joins an expedition to North America and encounters a Native American woman who comes up and asks her what she's called, which again is confusing because the point is that they can't understand each other, as depicted by this sort of mimicry, which is actually has been pointed out by anthropologists as being kind of like typical of situations where people are trying to understand each other. But apparently they kind of can. So the mechanism is a little bit confusing, but it shows us that people were aware of language conflict and that women particularly played a role. Also, the fact that Melkorka teaches her son Irish introduces this kind of like collusion between her and her son, so they have a secret language that no one else can understand. And it's pretty unusual in the sagas for a woman to have a very close relationship with her son. Usually the father kind of takes the son away. But this story is one example of a woman who maintains a very close relationship with her son And it's possible that the fact that they have this kind of secret, unique language is one reason for that. So I'm also looking at episodes of women traveling in the sagas. There's a lot of dispute about whether or not the evidence in the sagas is realistic for the time period that I'm looking at. It might be that women were free to travel in the 13th century, and that kind of gets imposed on stories of the 10th century. But it's still very interesting to see that the author of these sagas expect women to be involved and to be active in the community, to be traveling outside the home, to be traveling across oceans. One woman sails back to Norway on her own. And there's also this really interesting episode where a woman wants to travel with her lover to Norway, and he says, no, you have to stay at home and care for your brothers and your father because they're sick. And he leaves with his friend, and then his friend returns early and tells her that her lover has found another woman, basically, and convinces her to marry him instead. And then when her lover eventually returns and finds that they've been married, the two men enter this feud and eventually kill each other, and it's this tragic end to the story. And there's this little episode that says, basically, if he hadn't lied to her, then this would not have happened. And there's kind of I'm calling it fake news, but there's basically, the moral is that you shouldn't prevent women from accessing knowledge in the same ways that men do. And last, but certainly not least, I'm looking at the way that women use marriage in the sagas to their own advantage. So the standard formula in the sagas sort of portrays men as responsible for marriage arrangement, whether that's fathers, brothers, or sons controlling the remarriages of their widowed mothers. And marriage is primarily seen as a way for two men to cement a political alliance. But in many of the sagas focused on the Western diaspora, women actually have pretty extensive control over marriage, whether that's their own or that of their family members. So in this excerpt from Orkneyinga Saga, which is also known as the History of the Earls of Orkney, Frakuk, who is the daughter of a wealthy farmer and whose sister is the mistress of the Earl of Orkney, she's kind of depicted as a self-made woman. Her husband is written off as a nobody. His name is actually Ugly Nothing, which I guess should tell you something about her, in that she gains all this power despite her husband being an ugly nothing. And a rival earl comes and approaches her and asks her to combine their forces and seize half of Orkney, and she agrees, tells him that she will raise an army from her friends, family, and marriage connections, such as the one she has recently forged with a Scottish chieftain. And a similar situation takes place in the saga of, the story of Oither the Deep-Minded, which is the best name for a woman ever. And she, when all of her male relatives have died, she gathers up all her grandchildren and travels, kind of island hops, from Scotland up to Iceland, and marries off one of her granddaughters to each prominent family that she encounters, and in that way kind of makes this family network that covers all of the diaspora. And that's one of the examples of what I'm sort of pointing to as women creating these family links in a way that men couldn't, which kind of enabled, first of all, connection in general between the diaspora, but also women to be able to travel following these kin networks. And then there's another great example of a woman who uses marriage to her advantage, and her name is Ragnhild. And she is also the wife of an earl, but she arranges the murder of her first husband and marries his brother, and then promises to marry the man who will help her kill this new husband. And then when he's dead, she instead marries a different man, a third brother of the first two, who then helps her kill the man that she had promised to marry. And so with this complex manipulation of her own marriage, Ragnhild effectively makes herself the seat of power in Orkney. Only by marrying her can any of the men hope to secure rule over the earldom. So despite her rather ruthless tactics, she is described with respect, even bordering on admiration, by the author of Orkneyinga Saga. This episode, like many others, seems to point to a very different understanding of the concepts of gender in the Norse world. So a very famous Norse scholar, Carol Clover, has suggested that the Norse concept of gender wasn't actually based on the male-female binary that's prevalent in modern Western society, but rather on a spectrum from strong to weak. So women, just as much as men, could exhibit qualities of strength and intelligence, which brought them respect from all genders, while men, just as much as women, could be accused of showing weakness and bad judgment. Fraka kind of ascends the gender spectrum through her manipulation of marriage and her involvement in politics. And then throughout the saga, she's never insulted or disparaged for her ambitions. And actually, the language used by modern historians to describe her is much worse than what's used in the saga. So she's called a frightful person and an evil, interfering woman and a sorceress, which are words that are never used to describe her in the actual saga. So in light of Clover's sort of assertions about Norse gender, it's amusing that modern readers appear more offended by her behavior than 13th century Icelanders. Though gender may have been experienced differently in Norse society, allowing women access to power and authority as much as men, in general, women were still expected to act within the parameters of gendered roles as wives or mothers, using gendered institutions such as marriage or motherhood to achieve influence. Occasionally, though, these structures seem to have been overlooked in the West. In Scotland and the Orkneys, a high rate of male mortality may have led more women to take power in place of their dead male relatives, whether this meant arranging marriages or organizing military campaigns. And the integration of Celtic women into Icelandic families may have given rise to new ideas about the advantage of cultural flexibility and bilingualism. And at the same time, the sense of shame felt about lowly origins meant that Celtic women and perhaps remnants of Celtic culture tended to be erased or fictionalized in literature to soothe medieval anxieties. In the end, historians still have more to learn about how Viking women, whether Norse or Irish, old or young, elite or non-elite, contributed to the formation of unique identities in the Western diaspora.